Well, so on developers being greedy, or profit maximizing, if we want to use the economics term, I mean, they've always been greedy. We need to figure out how to get these costs down and down significantly.
Hi, and welcome to The Missing Middle. I'm Sabrina Maddeaux.
And I'm Mike Moffatt.
Today we're talking about shrinkflation, which goes way beyond just groceries. We're going to discuss how Canadians are paying more money for dramatically less living space and what this means for young people trying to build their lives.
And before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. So, Sabrina, I spent way too much time flipping through TikTok, and I imagine what the algorithm decides to show me is a whole lot different than what it decides to show you. So, I get a whole lot of 1980s stuff, like movie clips, music videos, a whole lot of pro wrestling, everything a boy from the 1970s could ask for. But one thing I see over and over, and I mean, I get a lot of these videos, is people complaining about shrinkflation at the grocery store. How cereal boxes are getting smaller, how a lot of things like granola bars that used to come in 6-packs now getting sold in packs of 4 or 5, but they're keeping the boxes the same. They're just kind of where it used to say 6, it now says 5. And they're having to do very creative packaging to fill in the gaps. And again, if you go to TikTok, you will find a lot of these videos. And if you engage with them like I do, apparently it won't stop feeding them to you. So TikTok has clearly figured me out because this stuff drives me absolutely up the wall. Like, I'm a pretty laid back guy for the most part. I don't get annoyed by life's little inconveniences. I get annoyed by like big level stuff, but this kind of little thing doesn't usually bother me, except this. This irritates me to no end. And I've actually stopped buying certain products because of it and certain brands, because I just feel like they're taking advantage of consumers. Now, you and I are in very different stages in our lives. I'm the dad of 2 kids who does a whole lot of grocery shopping. And I probably, because of it, buy way too much prepackaged food, which is the type of food that's most likely prone to shrinkflation. So it shouldn't be that surprising that it's an issue that resonates with me. So I have to ask you, like, is this something that younger millennials and Gen Z are noticing, particularly those of you without kids? Is this something on your radar?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I'm not even on TikTok and I've noticed it. And it's something that people talk about and get frustrated with because everyone goes to the grocery store and everyone inevitably notices it. For me, I've always been a big Kraft Dinner fan. And I remember as a kid, you could have a box of Kraft Dinner and my mom would make it up every so often and it could feed myself, my brother, and my parents could have some as well. Now a box of Kraft Dinner, I'm like, is this single serving all of a sudden? Am I just eating more? What's going on? And I actually went on Reddit to find out if anyone else was as frustrated and experiencing the same thing as me. And it turns out, yes, Kraft Dinner did reduce the serving size in their box. So now, like, it feeds, if you're lucky, one person, maybe 2 people for a snack. And like you, I actually stopped purchasing it because I'd have to buy like 2 or 3 boxes to actually make it into a meal these days, which is unfortunate. So it's something everyone's noticing and frustrated with for sure. But what I'm curious about is I know shrinkflation has been a topic of conversation for years, if not decades. Are companies employing this strategy more than in the past? And if so, like, why don't they just raise their prices? Reducing a package size seems way more deceptive and sneaky than raising prices.
Yeah, so companies are doing this more in the past, and there's a lot of really great research on shrinkflation in the economic literature. There's one fantastic study in particular I'm a fan of. It's still in working paper form, but you can find it online. We'll link to it in the show notes. And what this economist did is look at products in the UK from 2012 to 2023, kind of all types of products, but really kind of focused on things you would find in a grocery store. So if you look at those kind of grocery store products, what it found is that 80% of the time when a product size changes, they get smaller, not larger. So, you do see that when companies make tweaks, they're more likely to make tweaks to make things smaller. But 90% of the time, if you look at all of the product size changes, the cost per unit goes up. So what this means is even when a company decides to make their product larger, they increase the price by more than an offsetting amount. That's not shrinkflation, but that can actually hide a price increase, right? Because you kind of say, well, yeah, of course it's more expensive because the box is now 20% larger, not realizing that they've raised the price by about 35%.
Mm.
And in particular, because this research looked at a time series, looked at kind of products over time, they were able to look at, okay, when are companies more likely to employ these strategies? And not surprisingly, it's during times of higher inflation, where companies will kind of go, oh, yeah, we've really got to change our price on this because we're getting squeezed with costs or whatever, and they'll try to figure out again how to raise that price per unit. Sometimes that's just a price increase, but a lot of times it's the shrinkflation strategy. Now, this particular study didn't analyze the business strategy portion of it, but there are other studies out there, and you can look at biz school reports and things like that of why companies do this. And deception probably is part of it, that companies are trying to do this, though a lot of these strategies are so blatant that you would think that that would be kind of a short-sighted strategy where people would just get annoyed and not buy the product, feel like a bit of a bait and switch. And that's important for groceries, right? Because these are not one-time purchases, right? These are things that people buy over and over. So if they get overly annoyed, they might go buy something else. There are issues around competition, or these days to buy something else from a different brand when 10 different companies basically dominate the grocery store. But on top of that, there's some behavioral economics reasons why they do this. This is not just companies being jerks. One is that certain prices feel cheaper than they actually are. So $9.99 feels cheaper than $10, even though they're identical. Now we banned the penny. They literally are identical. So if you have a product where you could raise it to $10.99, you might be reluctant to do that because $10.99 seems like way more expensive than $9.99, relative to the actual difference. So companies like to keep products at certain price points and will make these changes to hit that price point. And another issue is what we call in behavioral economics, like anchoring. A lot of us have a mental model of what stuff should cost and what's kind of unreasonable to pay. And companies do all kinds of research on this. So if a lot of consumers have a mental model that says, hey, spending more than $6 on a box of cereal is unreasonable, then companies are much better off going, okay, we're going to do everything possible to keep that price under $6, even if it means making the box smaller or, changing the ingredient mix using, lower quality ingredients and so on, that can still lead to more sales than just going, okay, let's just keep doing what we're doing and raise it to $7. If that is seen as kind of a bridge too far for consumers, then companies are very, very reluctant to raise their prices at that level.
Mhm. Yeah, that's all really interesting. And I want to expand this out a bit because shrinkflation doesn't just apply to the grocery store, it's also happening with housing. And obviously, we hear a lot about housing prices and how those are out of control. But something that's talked about less is what buyers or renters are actually getting for those prices. And a big part of the housing crisis isn't just that costs have completely diverged from incomes, but that living spaces themselves have increasingly diverged from the reality of actually living in them, or at least living comfortably, right? So I'd love for you to lay out the actual data for our listeners. Just how much smaller have homes, particularly condos, gotten in recent years?
Yeah, well, on the condo side in particular, we have seen a lot of shrinkflation. So for Ontario, the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation, that's a corporation who figures out what your home is worth, and your sort of property taxes are based on that. They did a fantastic study on this, and we'll link to it in the show notes. So in the province of Ontario, and I would imagine we'd get similar results in British Columbia and other places, the median newly constructed condo has shrunk. It was about 965 square feet in the 1970s, and it's been reduced by about 35% to about 650 square feet today. And this reduction seems to have started 20 to 25 years ago in the early 2000s and has been continuing ever since. So it's not like a one-time drop. It just seems that every year these newly constructed units are somewhat smaller than the year before. And we have to keep in mind when we say median, that means like literally half are larger than that, than 650
Mhm.
square feet, but half are smaller. So we are seeing this big creation of these kind of shoebox condos, as you and Ron Butler and others refer to them, that didn't really exist in the 1970s, 80s, or 90s. So this is absolutely a real phenomenon. People are not imagining things when they see that the condos are getting smaller. We have very good evidence on this that they have shrunk by about 35% for the median condo, and most of that reduction has occurred in the last 20 years or so. So I haven't lived in an apartment, whether it be a condo or purpose rental, since 2002, and that was a unit built, I think, in the 1950s. So I'm not really speaking from experience here. But Sabrina, you're someone who has been apartment hunting over the last 10 years. You're a resident millennial. So what's your reaction to these numbers? Are you seeing this kind of shrinkflation firsthand?
Oh, for sure. Everyone is. And I think a lot of young people in Toronto talk about it in their frustrations because they know that when they're looking for an apartment or a condo, older buildings tend to have larger square footage. Last time I was looking for a two-bedroom, so many of the newer builds were like technically two bedrooms, but only 700 or 750 square feet, which is really, really small for that type of space. And then you look at one bedrooms, those are getting even smaller as well. So now, if you want anything that's 1,000 square feet, which is a bit more appropriate for two people living in it, or certainly if you're working from home, that's either a luxury build or you have to again get into an older building because it's very hard to find something like that that's been recently built. But this raises the obvious question for me. Why are units getting so much smaller? Like, is this just developers being greedy or are there other forces at play?
Well, so on developers being greedy, or profit maximizing, if we want to use the economics term, I mean, they've always been greedy. My dad is a sheet metal mechanic. He did duct work, like heating and cooling, HVAC work for apartments back in the 1960s and early 1970s. And if you think developers are cutthroat today, the stories my dad could tell you are absolutely wild. I'd have him on the
We
podcast, but we
should.
might have to bleep out some of those stories. So I don't think the issue is that developers are getting greedier. I think they've always been profit max. A lot of it has to come down to cost. That as land costs, development charges, and so on have gone up, it's basically shrinkflation. It's the kind of the same thing we see at the grocery store, has a lot to do with it. That if people can't afford to get a mortgage on a home that's more than $600,000 or $700,000, then developers are going to do what they have to do to hit that price point. And we mentioned this on a previous episode when prices were hitting $1,300 a square foot before the pandemic in downtown Toronto. That 1,000 square foot unit that you said that you and your partner would desire, that'd be looking at 1.3 million. So a lot of that is shrinkflation. A lot of that, and there's these kind of weird disconnects. So in 2017, for instance, the federal government made it more challenging to qualify for a mortgage over $1 million. So that was this kind of form of, like the $6 box of cereal, where developers, whether it be condos, townhomes, or whatever, would really do whatever they could to stay under that price point. So that has a lot to do with it. And I do think that the role that investors play, I think that role can be overstated, but it is real. That what gets built on the condo side, condos in Ontario, usually you have to have about 70% of pre-construction sales or more before you can start this building. And because younger people, occupants, don't really have the ability to put in a big down payment and wait 5, 6, 7 years for the condo to be built, these pre-construction sales mostly go to investors who put their money down. then wait that time. And then once the building is built, either rent out the units or sell them to someone else. So there's a lot of criticism, and again, I think it could be overblown, but it is a real phenomenon that what gets built on the condo side is often more what investors are interested in and what investors think will go up the most, what they think will be the easiest to flip when a unit is constructed. So that's kind of the two things that it's, a shrinkflation story because of higher costs, but also the way that condo buildings are financed and built.
Mhm. Yeah, but going beyond just square footage, there's also an issue of livable space and layouts. I've seen units where the quote unquote bedroom is barely bigger than a closet, or you can't fit a dining table anywhere, or there are unusable like pillars in the middle of a room or weird little nooks that you actually can't do anything with. Like, what's driving all these terrible design choices that take this shrinkflation problem beyond just the square footage number, but also cause shrinkflation in usable space?
Yeah, and again, a lot of that has to do because you've seen all of those things, but you've also seen in many cases like reduction in finishes and that kind of thing. And it's the kind of same thing if we go back to the cereal example, where that shrinkflation is not always just the box getting smaller, but it might be the replacement of certain ingredients. But the one that always gets me is ice cream. We've seen a lot of ice creams that can no longer call themselves ice cream because they've taken out so much dairy that it no longer meets the legal definition. So you do see things like that where developers are having to make these choices or feeling like they have to make these choices to hit a certain price point. There are issues as well with things like building code. We've talked about the issues around dual egress apartments that the way that apartments are built these days, because the building code, they're basically, have these hotel kind of layouts where you have a big hallway and units on either side, and that limits the type of units you can build because that combination of, having to have these kind of long and narrow units and the fact that bedrooms need to have a window really does kind of limit the types of geometries that you can make. And then you mentioned the kind of pillars as well that, I think a lot of times in the 1970s and 1980s, those spots that weren't that usable with pillars and things like that might have been used as storage space or things like that in the past. But now, uh, again, developers are trying to squeeze, every amount of margin they can out of this. So space that would have maybe not been considered particularly usable in the 1970s is now getting sold just again because those costs are so high. Now, we often hear that young people today have different preferences, that they want urban living, but they don't need as much space. They prefer experience over things. So, how much of the shrinkflation trend is genuine preference versus young people making the best of bad options? I have my theory on this, but I want to hear yours first, and then I'll let you know how I see things as somebody a generation higher.
Yeah, I don't think it's preference for the most part. I think young people still want livable spaces where they have a certain quality of life. Certainly, as they're getting into their later 20s, 30s, they might have a partner and they maybe even want children, right? But there's such a lack of those spaces. So they've been forced into smaller units, and that's also all they can afford because prices are so high. So I don't think there's this huge number of young people who want tiny micro condos. There might be a few in their early 20s who are willing to say, okay, I want to be downtown and I'm not in my unit very much anyway. So it doesn't really matter if it's any bigger than a hotel room. But again, that's a pretty small share of people. And we have way more of those micro units now than people who actually want them. But I would like to hear your take on this. So what do you think, Mike?
Yeah, it's exactly the same. So, the economists kind of use this concept called constrained optimization, where it's that individuals or economic actors basically make the decisions that are best for them, subject to whatever constraints they have. And there's this idea that we shouldn't infer preferences from the outcomes of constrained optimization problems, right? the reason why I'm not a starting pitcher for the Toronto Blue Jays is not, because I have a preference not to be. It's, because I don't reasonably have that option. I couldn't do it at 28, and I certainly can't do it at 48. So I think people get this wrong. I see a lot of my generation, Gen X and Boomers, who see what your generation does and say, oh, well, they don't want to own a home, or they're fine with smaller spaces, or they don't want a backyard. And I say, well, no, like, what are you basing that on? And they're like, well, they're not out getting these. Well, they're not getting them because they can't.
I can confirm young people like backyards.
Well, that's just it, right? So you have to, if I'm looking at this from an economist point of view, I'm like, you have to control for those other factors. So if we found, for instance, a bunch of, rich millennials who could afford those things, but are choosing not to, then we might go, okay, yeah, you know what? Preferences have changed, and preferences do change over time. The things that, we might have been interested in 20 or 25 years ago, people in their 20s might not be. So it's not unreasonable to think that preferences do change over time. But I do think older generations make this mistake where they say, okay, well, people in their 20s aren't doing these things, therefore they're not interested in them.
Mhm. Now, there's another interesting trend happening, though. So, we're starting to see record high inventories of small condos in Toronto and some resistance to buyers to these micro units, which is leading to the condo crash, which is making headlines. And we just did an episode on this, which we will link to in the show notes. But do you think we're reaching a breaking point with shrinkflation? Like, will this condo crash, which is hitting these investors' shoeboxes the hardest, be enough to solve the issue just through lack of market demand? Or are there other barriers at play?
I do think that these really small units aren't coming back. I do think that they are, where we are seeing the largest vacancies, where we are seeing investors having trouble unloading units. And a lot of it is, again, it goes to that kind of pre-construction side of it, where investors now have these extra units that they can't get rid of. And even if you had younger people who wanted them, they can't qualify for a mortgage at today's rates and those prices, right? So it's just kind of gummed up the market. And until those units are sold, investors aren't going to go out and finance new ones, right? So investors have largely gone from being on the buy side to being on the sell side. So, you know, so that inventory is actually kind of competing with the ability to build new inventory. And my fear is, and people often see this as a good thing. And you had a fantastic article in the Toronto Star a couple of weeks ago that we'll link to in the show notes. I think people go, oh, well, this is great. Now that the market for those has gone away, that we'll get a bunch of bigger units. And it's like, well, no, it might just get replaced with nothing. We've seen that happen before. We had a big apartment and condo boom in the late 1980s. We had a crash, and then it wasn't that, okay, we're going to build something else instead. It was just that housing starts and housing sales fell. It took nearly a decade to recover. So, this is one of those things where I say, like, be careful what you wish for. That, yeah, we might stop building these units that are challenging, that people don't necessarily want, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to get replaced with something better.
Mhm. So if we wanted to reverse this shrinkflation trend, what would need to change? Are there any specific policy changes that you think could help?
Yeah, and I do think we need to build more supply. And I think, again, this is where people get things wrong a little bit. That when economists and other analysts like me say, okay, we need more supply, uh, we're not actually advocating a policy there. We're just kind of suggesting an outcome. And then we have to sort of figure out, okay, well, what are the policies preventing us from getting the type of supply we need, and how do we move forward on that? And I think it comes back to that original point around shrinkflation. We need to figure out how to get these costs down, and down significantly. So taxes and fees are obvious ones. Development charges is the biggest one we talk about a lot. But the fact that you go and you buy a new home, a new condo, let's say in the city of Toronto, you're paying 8% provincial sales tax, some of which you get rebated, 5% federal sales tax, which none of which you get rebated, because the rebates get phased out well before any kind of reasonable price. 2% provincial land transfer tax, 2% municipal land transfer tax. Like you're paying this marginal tax rate of 17% on those units, and then there's all the embedded development charges and so on top of that. So we need to look at the tax side. We need to get the cost of land down significantly, and that's having more sensible land use policies. We need to speed up approvals processes. We need to deal with some of those building code issues to allow us to build in the middle. We do need to look at how we finance buildings. That I do think that there are problems with the pre-construction investor model, and I do think there are better ways that we can do it. But it all comes down to cost. If you don't control the costs, then only one of two things happens. Either what gets built has a price that's significantly higher than those costs, and you get shrinkflation and whatever else to deal with that, or nothing gets built. The only way that we can have affordable and attainable housing that's high quality is if those costs are substantially lower.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it all ties back to affordability at the end of the day. Well, thank you everyone so much for watching and listening, and to our amazing producer, Meredith Martin.
If you have any thoughts or questions about 1980s pro wrestling, please send us an email at missingmiddlepodcast@gmail.com.
And we'll see you next time.